In 384 BC, a man named Aristotle spoke of what it meant to be smart. And what he said was, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. In 60 AD, a Roman philosopher named Seneca continually asked himself three questions. First one, what bad habit did I cure today? The second, what temptation did I resist? And the third, in what way am I better today than I was yesterday? Flash forward to 2019, and according to the American Psychiatric Association, approximately 40% of Americans suffer from some form of anxiety disorder. Trying, in many ways, to build a clear path to get to know themselves, often they struggle with this concept of self-discovery, and without some kind of examination, be it self-examination or with some assistance, it's very difficult to get to what Aristotle described in the definition of smart and knowing yourself. Which brings us to this evening's guests. And her name is Karen Conlon. And Karen is a psychotherapist. And if you read Karen's website, she poses a very daunting question to the reader. Are you ready to take control of your life? And with that, it is a pleasure and it is an honor to welcome to the studios at 77 WABC, Karen Conlon.
Thank you so much, Chuck. I'm so happy to be here.
I am delighted, Karen. It is so cool to have you and I doing this together. We've known each other for many years. I stated, though, and I opened with something philosophical, but you're not a philosopher. I know that if we were to look at your LinkedIn profile, you are a psychotherapist.
Correct.
But you didn't get to psychotherapy from the get-go. Describe to us, give us your background. How'd you get there?
Sure, absolutely. So just to give you a little context, I am a first-generation Dominican American. My parents were immigrants. And when I started to grow up in this country, the pressures that I felt to live up to certain expectations were great. And I didn't have much of a chance to really think about what I wanted to do, think about who I wanted to be. I really needed to make sure that all of my mother's, because I lived with a single parent, that all of my mother's hard work was reflected in whatever career I chose. And so I spent a long time trying to think about that. I thought about law school. I thought about working at the UN because I had learned to speak a couple of different languages. And ultimately, I went to sales. I ended up in sales. I started off doing accounts receivables at Bloomberg. And after that, I went into a sales career. And throughout my career in sales, I ended up really changing industries often. I was very good at what I did, but I never found that reward, that personal reward, right? I mean, the money was not enough.
But what was the personal reward? Describe that. I think a lot of people may have trouble, as abstract as it sounds. What does it mean to Karen?
So what it means to me is connection. I needed and wanted more of a connection with people. And what I found was that during my time in sales, it is the common thread that kept me in sales was really that connection that I was having with people, the ease that I had with interacting with people, really understanding beyond what they were saying to me. It was a very, I found that along the way, people, strangers, waiters would just kind of start talking to me and telling me about their lives. And for a long time, it bothered me because I would say to myself, gosh, I just really want a meal here. But after a while, I said, why not embrace it? And at some point, I had my daughter later in years. And that's when I decided to think about, well, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? What is it that I'm going to do that's going to be meaningful and purposeful to me and personally rewarding? And that's when I started to do a little research, and I ended up going back to school and getting my master's in social work.
It sounded like then in the context of self-discovery and self-examination, did that happen in a moment, or did your thinking happen over the course of time?
It did not happen in a moment. There was a lot of dissonance, mental, emotional, spiritual, what I thought I was expected to be and what I thought I was supposed to be, versus having the courage to maybe think about who I really wanted to be and what I wanted to do with my life. And every step of the way, every job change, every career change, I thought about what is it about this job that I love, and I would ultimately come back to the connections and the bonds that I would build with people, and nothing else mattered that much as that point did.
Well, it seemed like there was a conflict. I don't know if that's the right way of putting it, because the conflict is what you're feeling, how you're evolving, and when you look in the mirror, how you view yourself. Yet, when you turn your face away from the mirror, you have potentially someone else's expectations. And in your case, you had your mom's, but there is also society does play a role into what people do. How did you resolve the conflict between what you had inside of you and those expectations that were external to what was inside of you?
So I began to do a lot of self-reflection and acceptance of the things that I knew about myself that I liked, and then acceptance about the things that I knew I didn't like so much. One of those things that I didn't like so much was feeling that I wasn't being brave and taking risks and making the choices that I wanted for my life. I mean, and that didn't mean necessarily in personal terms and in personal relationships, but I meant career and really wanting to do something that was important to me. I did do a lot of psychotherapy because I wanted to get some help and some insight. I knew at a certain point that what I was thinking and what I was figuring out wasn't enough. I had gotten to a point where, okay, great, some things are clear, but what do I do now? How do I figure out how to get out of this place where I feel stuck? And it was after doing some psychotherapy and really focusing on being okay with wanting and desiring things that I want internally.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, Karen, because often when we speak to others of transformation, sometimes there are pangs of guilt if somebody drives toward something that they want for themselves in spite of the fact that somebody else may not want it for them. Were you going through that?
Yes, there is a lot of guilt. There's a lot of guilt, at least for me. I can't speak for anyone else, but for me, the guilt part came in feeling or hoping or wondering if I'm disappointing.
Yourself or someone else?
Both, right? The societal expectations and my family being the first generation, I was sort of on this pedestal, and there was a lot to live up to, and the pressure would mount as time went by.
So high expectations, and it sounds like perhaps some fear of being crushed under the weight of those heavy expectations.
There's a fear of being crushed. However, in my mind, I had no choice. In the way that I was raised, being the eldest of 3 kids in a single parent household with a mom who worked 18 hours a day, I had to get over certain fears. There were internal fears that were a little bit more difficult for me to deal with because they had to do with my own needs. But when it came to the needs of the family, when it came to the needs of others, I just needed to get over that, right? And those fears. And I think that was part of what helped me to really build resilience. And part of why I do what I do today. That personal journey, that personal experience, and having to get through the really tough things that get in the way really helped me to understand, everyone has these inner strengths. Everyone has resilience. The difference is that some people know it and other people are just not aware of them yet. That is what I believe. That is what motivates me to do this work. Partially my experience and going through that and seeing people evolve and not always knowing, not always seeing what I see. So maybe there's a little bit of a personal.
I think any of us, whatever we do for a living, particularly Karen, you wake up every day in the service of somebody else's health, somebody else's happiness, their success. And I think anytime you dedicate yourself to a craft, particularly one that is very personal, that you're able to help someone with their mountain, you can't help but see yourself in that, because what you said is you sought the therapy in the path to your own self-examination. Did that help you to further develop what you were going to do for a living? Because I'll say that because I've worked with salesmen all my life. You're the only one I've ever known that made an enormous transformative move from salesperson to psychotherapy.
If I think about that trajectory, the truth of it is that while I was in sales, I was doing a lot of this work already, I think, right? I mean, untrained and without the education, but just innately. In sales, in corporate sales, and in consultative sales, you really are inquisitive and curious, and you really need to understand the what's in it for me of the other person and what it is that they need that is going to help them, right? And whatever image or whatever their goals are. And so in doing that work, I was always curious and genuinely interested. And I think that maybe that is part of what made me successful in that respect within the realm of sales. And so it didn't matter what industry I went to when I was in sales, that was the one thing, right? When I spoke before about the common thread, that was the one thing that stayed the same, which is there was a constant curiosity, there was a constant wanting to understand more than what's being told to me, right? Mm-hmm. And really understanding what is keeping you from making that decision. What is it that you're afraid of, or what is it that you're not getting or understanding or hearing? And so I feel that I've been doing this work all along. It just hasn't been categorized.
All right, we're going to talk about that category in just a minute. You're listening to A Climb to the Top, Stories of Transformation on 77 WABC. I'm Chuck Garcia. My guest is Karen Conlon. Karen, now we are in a very big transition here because what you have described so far has led you to a path to what is mid-career, a big change in profession. I suspect that came with a whole lot of education and the interruption of your career midstream. Tell us what you did and how you came to that decision.
So as I mentioned earlier, I became a mother a little bit later, and I took a moment during that time, during my initial years of motherhood, a couple of years, to focus on my child and then also focus on myself. And it wasn't that hard to do because I had a lot of moments of quiet, believe it or not, with my kiddo. And it was during those moments that I decided, well, what's my quality of life? What do I want and what do I need? What do I want the next 40 years to look like for me? That is actually a question that I asked myself. And at some point I decided, well, let me just research, let me talk to some social workers, let me talk to some psychologists. I really got a lot out of therapy. I think I like that. I like dealing with people. And fast forward, that is where I started to then apply for a master's degree in social work. Although social work, I think most people, when they think about social work, depending on what your experience is, you might have a preconception of what it is. But you can actually choose many different paths. My path was the clinical path. And in doing that, I went to a school that really focused a lot on the clinical aspect. And then I continued my training. This is where I am today.
Well, this is interesting because as you were on the receiving end of the therapy, I take it you were beginning to visualize, hey, what would it be like to be on the other side of the table?
Yes.
Because from what you learned about your own self-examination, did that become the basis of, hey, I can do this?
Yes. You know, Chuck, when I think about that question, I think about the self-examination that I did throughout this process, and I think about all the things that therapist or the therapist that I saw really, the wonderful provocative thoughts that came through, and the discovery, the self-discovery that I had on that couch. And I wanted to give that experience to other people because I learned while I was going through that process, things about myself, things about that I was consciously aware about and things that I was not consciously aware about that were driving my behaviors or driving the decisions that I was making. And because emotions drive behavior, I was able to figure out a lot of things and make a lot of connections, not only about myself, but about my childhood, the big T traumas or the little T traumas, or all the different aspects that shaped who I became and who I was sitting on that couch. I wanted so much to give that experience to people. I wanted so much for other people to experience what it is like to feel the experience of gaining control of their lives, especially in areas where they feel so out of control, for example, with anxiety.
Let's take that, this state of high anxiety. We know, or at least it seems to be somewhat agreed on, that the more or the greater proliferation of technology in the modern era, the greater scale of depression, anxiety, social isolation, social disorders.
Yeah.
Now that you became a first social worker, but on the path to psychotherapist, tell us about the state of the world as it relates to what you went through and how you now help others. What do you see?
Well, what I see is that, and what I now understand is that oftentimes we are walking through life, reacting, and not necessarily assessing situations or evaluating. We're just reacting. And going down that path sometimes leads people to believe, or leads one to believe, that that is the only way and that that is the only path to take and that there are no other options. And that if you stray off that path, there are some catastrophic results or consequences to pay. And what I have learned through my own experience and through treating people who want that bravery, who want to gain that knowledge, is that it definitely is not a straight path, and that you will make changes along the way that people will not like, other people won't like, and that may not fit the mold.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, Karen, because I know in my profession of executive coaching, I deal with a lot of people that want to change, but one of the hardest parts of change I found is in the concept of acceptance. Yeah. What are they willing to accept so that they stop beating their head against the wall and figure out maybe there's an alternative path? With the levels of anxiety that you treat, tell us about the factors that are important to help people in that self-examination and self-discovery to help them get on that path, be it straight or jagged, the path to healing.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that I always tell people when I first meet them, that the first thing they say to me is, I want to get rid of this anxiety. I can't take it anymore. The first thing I explain is, I can't help you do that. Because I want you to be safe, right? And anxiety is not something that we want to get rid of, because anxiety has helped us for millions of years and it will continue to help us. Anxiety keeps us safe. and will continue to keep us safe. Anxiety has a purpose. Sometimes it is what helps us to meet deadlines. It is what helps us to get to places on time and hand in projects. So anxiety has its place. That being said, when anxiety gets to the point where your quality of life is now interrupted, where you're unable to meet certain obligations because worries and concerns are getting in the way, worries and concerns about things that maybe have not even happened yet, or maybe things that have happened in the past and you're worried about them happening again. When that anxiety gets in the way, then that is when you run into disorders, right? Anxiety disorders. So that's one of the things that I tell people and explain, we don't want to get rid of your anxiety. We want to teach you how to manage it. And then the next part in terms of acceptance is accepting that anxiety is a part of life.
Well, what you're suggesting, though, is even before you say, I can help you or I cannot help you, perhaps we need to reframe the definition of anxiety and understand the trade-offs between the good things, i.e. even tension, anxiety.
Yeah.
We need them. We can't do good things necessarily without that tension and sometimes the anxiety that helps us to propel the things we don't think we can do. But you're just trying at a very minimum level to help them alleviate pain.
Yeah.
There are symptoms and then there is how they feel. Describe what you walk through with the patient in order to establish the foundation of how you help them to heal.
Absolutely. So one of the first things that I think is really, really important in treating patients who experience anxiety is to give them a framework of what anxiety really is. And my work is very neuroscience informed, and so I talk a lot about the brain, and I don't go into a science or a scientific explanation necessarily, but I do help them to understand the difference between anxiety that's coming from the prefrontal cortex versus anxiety that's coming from the amygdala, which is what I call the body's alarm system, and what that looks like. So in helping people to understand and get them motivated to do the work that we're going to embark on, I personally think that it's incredibly important to help people understand that the work they're going to do is not just abstract and let's hope it works. We are making cognitive and behavioral changes. We are going to do work that it will literally retrain the brain. We are going to change the neural pathways and that are already there, right? And we're going to do that by helping you, first of all, learn how to identify what type of anxiety am I feeling, right? Is it top down, where it's just thoughts, or is it bottom up, where I feel it in my body first? Because the treatment, right, the strategies and the tools, rather, for those two types of anxieties are different. The way that you approach it will be different. And so I give people a framework of what we're doing, and every week that we are in session, there's work to do in between sessions. I tell them, listen, you're the one doing the hard work, okay?
You're the guide. They're doing the heavy lifting.
I'm here to guide you, and really the hard work happens, right, in between sessions. And then you give me some feedback, and we talk about it, and then we talk about what could have happened there, what they can do, and then, okay, when this happens again this week, let's implement that. Do you feel comfortable implementing that? Because this is also collaborative. Part of gaining control over things is, number one, being able to identify what you actually can control and what you cannot control, because a lot of people focus on things that they cannot control. Right. And this creates this ongoing circle of insecurity and lacking self-confidence and increased anxiety. The next part of it is identifying what type of anxiety am I feeling, okay? And depending on what type of anxiety I'm feeling, what is the strategy that I'm going to apply? And then finally, the collaborative piece. In order to help people be motivated, I work very collaboratively, because it's important that you say to me, yes, Karen, I think I can do that this week. If I just tell you, Chuck, this is what you're gonna do, you may or may not do it, right? Because what's in it for you? Right. I know what's in it for me, that I'll feel better that I gave you something to do. but I don't know that you have bought into that.
Right.
So the buy-in needs to be there, and there needs to be clarity around why you're doing what you're doing.
Well, what you're describing, it sounds there are three elements just from the layperson's point of view. Number one is just education, helping them.
Yes.
It's not, you can't come in and say, hey, Karen, you're a therapist, help me to relieve my anxiety. Would that it be so simple? But first starts with a foundation of what we're doing here and why we're doing it. The second thing, I have to believe, and this is probably where you excel in all facets, but particularly helping to set and manage those expectations. Because I have to believe my intuition tells me they're sometimes unrealistic.
Yes.
I come in, I got a therapist, my anxiety is gone. Not that simple.
Yeah.
And then the third is the partnership.
Yeah.
The understanding that we're in this together.
Yes.
We're each other's teachers. You must learn from every one of your patients just as they learn from you.
Yes.
And then you take those three things, that becomes the basis of how you help people.
Yes. You've really summarized it so beautifully. That therapeutic connection, that therapeutic alliance, that relationship is the most important aspect of positive outcomes, of potential positive outcomes.
Right.
Okay, and that is what is going to make the biggest difference in what happens in this.
In what their outcome.
Yes, that is correct.
I suspect it takes a long time, or there's checks along the way where you begin to see and measure to the extent you can. Are they healing? Are they feeling better? Is that how it goes, your metrics?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there is always a check-in. And as that relationship becomes stronger, the bond becomes stronger and people trust you more, they become more open about saying, you know what, that didn't really work for me. Wonderful. That's what I need to know. But it may work at another time, so we put it in our toolbox, right, for future use. This
is fascinating, Karen. I'd like us to conclude this with... leave our listeners and viewers, given this is a podcast as well, and they can view us, leave them with three things. What are the takeaways for anyone who is contemplating this self-examination? What would you tell them?
So the first thing that I would say is that mental health, the treatment of mental health oftentimes carries a lot of stigma. And we don't have that same stigma when it comes to other types of health conditions that we need to treat, right? I mean, no one would think twice if, say, oh, I have diabetes or I have some other condition, hypertension. No one thinks twice about getting that cared for.
Okay, so number one, overcoming the stigma.
Okay,
number two,
overcoming the stigma. The other part of it is to know that getting that help, just piggybacking on that, getting help to get to the next level or to get beyond where you're feeling stuck does not signify weakness.
Okay,
it is not a sign of weakness, and quite the contrary, it really shows that you know what you need.
Indeed. And let's leave them with the last one.
The last one I think I would want to say to anyone listening is that you deserve the chance to give yourself that opportunity to learn more about what your inner strengths are, your resiliency, and that your past does not define you. Your past does not have to become your future if you don't want it to be.
Every day you have an opportunity to shape that future.
Every day.
And Karen, where can one find you?
So I can be found online at www.karenconlontherapy.com and on Instagram and on Facebook.
And on social media. Well, Karen, thank you so much for coming into this studio.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was such a pleasure having you here. This is A Climb to the Top, Stories of Transformation on Talk Radio 77 WABC. I'm Chuck Garcia, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you.